could take their seats. As you can see, I decided to let everybody sleep in this morning. That's why we're starting 2 minutes later than what the schedule shows. We had a wonderful day yesterday, and today is equally as exciting. We really have a terrific group of speakers and panelists. And just one little update from yesterday, well, two things. One, if you need anything on CLE, Deanna Evans, one of the student volunteers, one of my terrific superstars, is outside, and she will help you with any CLE matters that you need. Second thing is, people yesterday were saying, they were giving me some feedback about the conference. They kept saying, Charlie, we've really enjoyed the conference. But you know, and we like the fact that there are so many students and members of the armed forces here, but you really haven't done a good job at telling us how we can support your center. They keep saying, how you can do that? How can we do that? And so we have plenty of these sheets around. Actually, nobody said that, but anyway, this morning, this is one of my mentors is here, and he kindly agreed to be a speaker at the conference. And people have asked me about the conference, and a little bit of insight about how you put together a conference is you get this image in your mind, and you have this list of A players that you want to invite. And usually you invite them, you get about a third, and then you B about a third, but C about a third, and you put them all together, and actually you have a good conference. This time, though, all the A players said yes. And I'm really, really just stunned that General Scales was able to make time in his schedule. You've probably seen him on television, on Fox Television. He's one of the commentators. But I hope you've had a chance to scan his biography that's online and also on the easel outside, because it is really, really magnificent. He's a combat veteran. He's written a very important book on Vietnam, on firepower and limited war. He has a number of books. He's a commentator. He's been a mentor. He was commandant of the Army War College. And on a personal basis, he really, honestly, he put my career on track. Because years ago, when I was a young lieutenant colonel, he invited me to the Army War College, which at that time, he was joint before it was fashionable. It wasn't really fashionable at this time to be joint, to make a presentation at the Army War College on asymmetrical warfare and the Western mindset. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, General Scales, but that was in the mid-1990s. And one of the things that I had in that speech, which is in a book that the Army War College, it was about using airliners as weapons, and that's what the adversaries. That earned me a visit from some people wondering where I got that idea. And I said, well, remember the Iranian, okay. You can imagine. But really, I've asked him to speak. We've heard a lot about generalship, about officership. We've had some unfortunate incidents. He has probably done more thinking about the development of officers, about civil-military relations and so forth, than probably any senior military veteran that I know. Is there anybody that's done more of that than you, sir?
Dick Cohn.
I qualified it, though. Because, Dick was one of my mentors as well, so I have to navigate this very carefully. So I said senior military veteran. But I'm very much looking forward to the remarks, as we all are. Sir, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much. Of course, when I mentored Lieutenant Colonel Dunlop at the time, I didn't realize I'd created a monster. Because in the 90s, you heard Jim Mattis talk about it last night, we were engaged prior to 9/11 in a war of words, literally a war of words between the services. And the Air Force had any number of luminaries, Rebecca Grant, Chuck Link, Dave Deptula, and we formed a little community of mutual acrimony. The Air Force had their set, the Army had theirs. I generally represented the Army in these verbal faults. You saw Jim Mattis last night, and Paul Van Riper was a Marine Corps guy, and a guy named Art Sobrowski, God rest his soul, was the principal arguer for the Navy, and on many times, Charlie and I would go mano a mano in front of very large and influential audiences. And I must say, and I mean this sincerely, Charlie, is that clearly the true gentleman in this crowd was always Charlie Dunlop. We've been friends for many years. When it comes to the military art and science, we agree on absolutely nothing. But we do agree on our mutual friendship and admiration. And I think Duke University is extremely lucky to have Charlie as a member of your team, because he is an extraordinary human being. Thank you for having me, Charlie.
Sir, can I just have one alibi?
Yeah, go ahead.
As mentioned, General Scales has a Ph.D. from Duke University. Not just, oh my God, I forgot that. The publicists are going to be all over me. What are you doing?
Oh, that was a long time ago. I want today, in the time I have, to talk about generals and generalship and strategic leadership and how to make better generals. I got this from, I'm going to take my coat off if you don't mind. I got this from an essay I did in Foreign Affairs about 6 or 7 months ago, which is a reaction to a book called The Generals by Tom Ricks. Many of you may have read it. And it caused me to go into a great deal of depth to think about this, because no one who ever war stars has ever written about generals. And Charlie and I have had this conversation before. I mean, we like being a general. And 11 years as a general was really nice. And I think Charlie would agree, Duke or not, it's really hard not being a general anymore. For me, I'm getting emotional. My wife's in the back of the room. But I mean, Charlie can remember, as I can, immediately after retirement, you get up in the morning, you get your cup of coffee, you get your newspaper, and you'd go out and you'd sit precisely in the right rear seat of your vehicle. And sometimes you wait 20 or 30 minutes and no one would drive us to work. It's a tough transition to make. But the good news in all of it, of course, is that we're no longer, now that we're retired, we're no longer obsessing on PowerPoint. So what I want to do to you is just talk about this thesis today, and I'll go through as quickly as I can in the time I have available. Much more to it, obviously. But my theme is how the military selects, promotes, and educates generals. Right now, we have a problem in the military in placing the right person in the job at the right time. In the era of American wars, in the era that's principally the focus of Ricks's book, the era since the end of World War II, we've always had this problem with mixing together the professional qualifications and the personalities of an individual to fit a specific job. And the media recently, too, has taken particular aim at generals. I don't need to go down the list and embarrass anybody, but we're all familiar with the Stan McChrystal, Dave Petraeus, Kip Ward difficulties over the last few years. Much of it due, I would argue here this morning, to this problem of what Tom Ricks calls political military discourse, or the ability at the strategic level of leadership and the strategic level of war, where the military intersects with the civilians, to get along, to make policy and provide advice to the senior command authority. And as we exit from Afghanistan, there's a certain feeling amongst many of us, Charlie included, that something's missing in our structure. There's something about our past that makes us not as good at this as we ought to be. And it's particularly difficult for me because I'm going to teach you some inside baseball this morning. And I'm probably the first guy to talk about this ever that I can think of. First of all, I'm a historian. You're locked in the room. You're not going to get out. I'm going to tell you some history. So hang in there, lawyers. The U.S. Army cut its teeth at the operational level of war. Recall, you have three levels: strategic, operational, and tactical. We did this after Vietnam when we were so sick. My generation was so sick of dealing with the nasty politics of political military relations that the Army committed itself to becoming the greatest operational artist since the Wehrmacht in World War II. And we were going to reinvent it literally from the ground up, and we did. And this revolution, if you will, led by, called Airland Battle, led by General Starry, Bill DePue, down the list. I was part of this in the late 70s. Crafted a manual and an operational method and put together the bits and pieces, the National Training Center, the training that was objective, it was controlled, had an AAR, and it was done in an incredibly realistic fashion. And so between 1973 and 1989, no army in the world was better at big formation, heavy warfare than the United States Army. And, you know, the gods of war are a perfidious lot. And it's almost just as you get good at one thing, they change the subject. And so what happened after 9/11 increasingly was that the point of intersection for change and control of our wars shifted from the operational to the strategic. And anytime we were called on to do operational, the great wheel in the first Gulf War, the march to Baghdad in the Second World War, we did it brilliantly. But it's when we had to shift to the strategic level of war and change the nature of war and to change how ground forces fought that we found ourselves in trouble. And you have to ask, why were we so slow to adapt to this? Why were we so clunky in knitting together the non-military aspects of war, the humanitarian, the human and behavioral aspects of it, obviously the diplomatic parts of war, the coalition and allied parts of war? Well, that's strategic, not operational business. It's because I believe that we have walked away from this political military interface because it was too hard to do and too embarrassing for my generation. And we created a generation that wanted to make the trains run on time, which of course is the essence of the operational art. So if you can get the objective on time and capture the objective and collapse it, then you're successful. So we came up with this idea, and I was victim of it myself, the so-called red flag officer. I mean, if you're an assistant division commander in Korea and it's 20 below and you show up at a rifle range and it's at 0700, the red flag is up, the hot coffee is there, and as soon as your Humvee drives up, the first round goes down range, and what's the first thing you say? Who's in charge? And a little lieutenant comes trundling out and salutes, and you think to yourself, this is one smart young kid, and he's done so well at the tactical level. But there's no indication at all of what his skills are 20, 25 years down the road, once you've selected him out as an exceptional officer, to demonstrate those same skills in the State Department, the halls of the Pentagon, or dealing with allies in NATO headquarters. Over the last 3 or 4 years, 3 theater commanders were relieved, and a number of senior officers in advisory positions have confessed their own ability to engage in this nexus. In other words, the very people themselves charged to do this will tell you, at the end of the day, they're just not very good at it. Now, let me just put generals in the context of the last 10 years. Remember Mattis last night talked about something I've been pushing a long time called positive traumatic growth, the fact that in times war makes you better. But PTSD is the opposite side of that pole. And PTSD is not just being blown up in an IED. There are general officers with PTSD, 2 of them you know of. John Allen, of course, is one, and Carter Ham is the other, and many 3-stars who will confess to it. You can get PTSD not just by coming close to death, but having your own men and women die needlessly. And so we have a stressed generation of generals who've been asked over the last 10 years to do extraordinary things. Remember, some of their active service goes back to 1995 in the Balkans. Some of these guys have been at it for over close to 20 years. So you have this body of men and women who have a difficulty adjusting to dealing beyond the operational and the tactical level of war, and difficulty just doing the right thing at the strategic level of war. And let me read this. And my conclusion is that the problem statement is we must find those who possess the strategic right stuff. I call it strategic genius. To be as dominant at the strategic level of war as lower-ranking leaders are at the tactical and operational level of war. I took a look at this as, well, who's the strategic genius? And if you're going to write anything down, write this down, because I think this is kind of important. What I discovered is there's not one strategic genius that you can point out. I've kind of found four, and let me try these out on you. First is the usual suspects, combat generals. These are guys who operate magnificently at the grand operational level of war. People like Patton, Ridgway. I'd throw McChrystal in there. I think it's not just that these guys are brilliant at following the plan or even writing the plan, but they're brilliant at audibles and being creative once the plan goes wrong. And I think that describes all three of these very well. But then there's, to Charlie's point, there's political genius. This is probably one of the more difficult things to foster in our current system. And in that I would put certainly Colin Powell, Dave Petraeus. No one, I think, did it better than Dave. And probably Max Taylor, although some would argue that it was political genius applied in the wrong fashion. He certainly had the talent. The third is institutional genius. Stick with me here. Institutional genius is the ability to take your particular service or your particular military entity and have it meld with the civilian mechanisms around you. You could call it a budget drill if you want, but some people are some generals are very, very extraordinarily good at this. Three come to mind. Of course, Creighton Abrams in the 70s that rebuilt the Army after Vietnam. Max Thurman, who in the late 70s, early 80s did the same thing at creating the all-volunteer force or making it work. And then I would argue Jack Keane in the years prior to 9/11 got the Army back on its feet when opposed by legions of people, I won't mention any names, Rumsfeld, who felt that the Army really had no place in a technocentric army of the future. And here's the last one. Just think about this for a minute. I call it anticipatory genius. And these are the generals, and I have three listed here. J.F.C. Fuller, the British Major General many of you are familiar with in the Interwar years. Don Starry, the author of Airland Battle. And John Nagel, who wrote Eating Soup with a Knife, the sort of conceptual document that moved us away from big army to small army. And these are particularly difficult generals to find because they're not terribly well liked. They tend to be loners, and they tend to be dreamers. And the art of future gazing is just that. It's an art in a service that's essentially a scientific branch. Oftentimes, as I say, they're ostracized, and many of them don't make general, which is interesting, or if they do, they get hammered as a general. Names like that some of you may know, like Starry and the younger, Killebrew, Vastasega, people that we all talk to on a daily basis. These are men of extraordinary genius, and they're anticipatory, and they can look into the future. But there's no place in the intellectual institution of the Army for them to fit. So what makes a strategic genius, and how do we do that? Well, it all begins with culture. The biggest obstacle for doing this right is institutional culture. Armies change. Army culture changes. But it changes very, very, very slowly. That's the problem. We have different clans right now. We have different tribes. The two clans are historically the Europeanists, and then you have the Asiatics. Asiatics are generally defined as Marines. Europeanists is the heavy army, been with us since the end of World War II. And the different clans or tribes are defined by the different functions. You have heavy, light, airborne, aviation, and so forth. Each of them have their own. And within each of these clans, you have grandees, the sons and daughters of great men who somehow feel pride of place as you go up, and they carry forth this tradition as they go up the ranks, and they tend to ossify the institution just because of who they are and what they've done in the past. But what's so interesting is there's no strategic clan. There's no clan of strategic genius in the Army, nowhere. Some of it's here, but who are they? Well, these are majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels, and a few generals who associate less with the grandees and the clans and the tribes, and increasingly more with their fellow intellectual travelers. I mean, I'm probably better friends with Dick Cohen than I am with many of my operational military friends, because we write and we speak the same language and we deal with the same subjects. And these strategists are sort of wrenched away from the mainstream. They have no course to take them to generalship. And many of them, particularly young officers in droves who have these special talents, strategic right stuff, have no point of attachment. And therefore, they tend to leave the Army in droves. Wonderful article by Dave Barno on that subject a couple of weeks ago. So what's happened is that an interesting phenomenon. So the heavy army was the clan of choice from the Great Wheel to the March to Baghdad. And in 10 years of war, where counterinsurgency becomes the dominant form of warfare, then we've seen the focus on clans and tribes begin to shift very slowly from picking heavy generals. I'm talking about, not talking about weight, I'm talking about what they do, picking heavy generals and increasingly picking the lighter generals to lead. The seminal event, as you may know, was the famous 2007 Brigadier Generals Board, where the Chief of Staff of the Army submitted the usual list of heavy generals to lead the Brigadier Generals Board, and Gates sent it back and said, no, let's start again. And he put Petraeus in charge of that board, took him out of Afghanistan to do it. I know, I had dinner with him the night before he left, and that led to people like H.R. McMasters and Mick Nicholson and these other light officers, coin officers coming to the fore. But here's what's so interesting about this process. It takes so long to do that, that by the time you put the right guys in the right job, the cycle of war's changed. So just about the time we get it right to move the heavy generals out and bring in this new clan, who knows? If our next opponent is Iran or China, the pendulum may swing back towards heavy generals again, and there you have it. You're trying to do coin somewhere around Bandar Abbas. It doesn't work, guaranteed. So that's the problem, is there's no flexibility in this pendulum of change simply because the different tribes move so slowly. And it's very sad to me today that the young officers really fail to understand the importance of strategic genius and to prepare for it. Because in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many here, this is not something you learn at the War College. You don't wake up one morning and start studying strategy. It's something you need to do all your life. But again, the system mitigates against that. And oftentimes, those within the Army have little regard for eggheads. I could name a few. Dave Petraeus comes to mind. No love lost there between Dave and the heavy generals. Wes Clark, last guy to win a war by my estimation, not terribly well regarded by members of the heavy clan. Let's just talk for a minute about those who, by consensus within the General Officer Brotherhood, are considered to be particularly good at this military political genius. The first one that comes to mind, many of this name may not resonate, is Pete Corelli, former Vice Chief of the Army. He said, who did the best in Iraq? Well, Corelli. Marty Dempsey, when he commanded the 1st Armored Division in 2004. Yeah, he made the transition brilliantly. One you talked to us last night, Jim Mattis. Another one I'd throw into this is Mike Mullen. He's a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was a surface warrior in the Navy and spent his 4 years trying to learn the art of war on land. And how are they able to do this? What is there about them that makes them different? And I call this, I guess, in my writings, I call it the Petraeus model. This is long before he started, well, you know the deal. But what do they have in common? All of them Well, they all attended a fully funded graduate school for 2 years to get at least a master's degree or in 2 cases a Ph.D. They all were given a sabbatical to spend for reflective thought and to teach. And they all of them returned back to the force to be able to apply those theories, not at the tactical or the operational level, but at the strategic level. So you have 2 general officers in particular, Dempsey and Corelli, that went back to war as strategists and not operational artists. And the results speak for themselves. Now, there are also latecomers. There are also people who come into the side, if you will, at the wrong place and time to become brilliant at the strategic level of war. We use Ray Odierno, the current chief of staff, as an example. I mean, if you read Tom Ricks's book, Fiasco, you recall that when he commanded the 4th Infantry Division, he was tying Iraqis on the hoods of Jeeps and driving them around Baghdad. But he learned, and he adapted, and he re-entered at the strategic level, and by most accounts has done a brilliant job, if you read Ricks's 2nd book about him. Another one that comes to mind is Ulysses Grant. I mean, this is a failed tanner from Galena, Illinois, a guy who couldn't run a 60-acre farm outside of St. Louis, who had to borrow from his brother and his father just to feed his family. And then by the time of Fort Donelson and Shiloh, he clearly became the greatest strategic genius this country has probably ever produced. So there's surprises out there. You can't necessarily go by someone's academic pedigree to figure out who's got the strategic right stuff. So in my remaining time, the question is, very interesting, Bob. Thank you for your history lesson. But what to do? What do we do about it? Well, the first thing we have to do is fix the values and the morality issue. It's different today than it was in World War II. Everybody knows about Kate Summersby and Eisenhower got that. You know, the story, probably apocryphal, of his chief of staff, Beadle Smith, screwing mirrors on the window of his apartments in London. I got all that. But the world is different today. The media are able to pick up on peccadillos and turn them from minor transgressions into major screw-ups in a matter of hours. Is that important to the person and the family? Of course it is. But it's more important in today's environment, at the strategic level, dealing with foreign governments and dealing with the media, not to do that. Needs to be some way to stop that. And then you have inside baseball. And as many of you know in uniform, inside baseball, when it comes to ethics and values, you have the corrosive leader, the toxic leader, the one who forces bright young officers out of units. We have to be able to identify those and move them somewhere else. So I think the first thing I would suggest in this process of making a strategic leader is we need a realistic evaluation. We call it in the Army a 360 degree that allows peers, seniors, and juniors to rate everybody. So you can find those who don't have the ethical right stuff and not put them on the fast track to generalship. Second, there's a certain time in an officer's career pattern where the big move is made. I guess in law, it's when you make partner. Medicine is when you become board certified. In the military, it's about the 10th year of service when you're selected ahead of your contemporaries for major. To me, when you're going to make a strategic general, this is the place where you start. Now, not everybody who makes an early promotion to major makes general, but virtually every general gets promoted early to major. Why is this important? Well, because the process of selecting at 10 years of service is based entirely on what? Tactical excellence. The guy with the red flag, he does that brilliantly. But can he talk to the National Security Council? You don't know. So there needs to be a way in the process at about this time, not only to protect or to pick out those that make the trains run on time. We should have those. We need those. Nobody does it better than us. But we have to have a mechanism in place to broaden the base of that selection so that you bring into the Army a small group of officers. I don't know, pick a number. I just picked 300 because it seemed about right. Who are different, who have some proven excellence in their ability to think and to write and to think critically, and have demonstrated the potential for being strategic leaders. Do they have to be good as a combat leader? Yeah, sure. But there's this other thing that makes them good. And so this early promotion then becomes sort of the nexus. By the way, it drives the Army crazy. I mean, the senior Army leadership's known this for years. Even Pete Schoonmaker, who was Chief of Staff a couple ago, actually had a thing called Task Force Bench, where he tried to find majors and colonels who he thought would be able to fit as generals. And I asked him one time, I said, why are you doing this? He goes, every goddamn time I go to put a guy in the National Security Council, the personnelists give me two options, and both of them are bad. And he says, and we know it's not going to work, but the system drives one of these two guys. And not only is it bad for the service, it's bad for him, because he's going to fail, because he's not prepared. Not that I feel strongly about it. And then, the second is selection for colonel. The secret for making great strategic generals of strategic genius, is to make great colonels. Because if you get a broad enough bench of colonels who are particularly gifted in the business of strategy, then you can allow those to fall away because of personal illness, or because they leave the Army to go to the NSC, or because they want to stay in the field and lead brigades. All that's important. But you need to have enough left over at that. So when you go to the brigadier or to the general's board, you have a rich assortment of red flag men and strategists, or those who can think at the strategic level. So again, the number is about 300. Anybody know how many generals the Army selects every year? All the crap you've been reading in the newspapers. You know? Anybody know? 30. You have this image of this huge, huge bureaucracy. Only 30 a year. And only about 2/3 of those can even be lumped into the rubric of strategists. It's a very small cut out of that 300. But the BG's board then becomes the final sort of selection process. This is appropriate for me to talk to you this as we select a new Holy Father, because the two systems are absolutely identical. And in fact, they do have a place. Actually, the Marines do. It's called the Sistine Chapel. And everybody waits for the white smoke. But a little bit about that, because this is where the culture can be most directly changed. I mentioned the 2007 Gates Brigadier General Board. There's 2 4-stars, a couple of 3-stars, and a couple of 2-stars to represent unrepresented minorities in the military, usually pilots. No, that's a joke. So it's a board of about 9 or 10, and they picked 30. Well, there needs to be something, in my humble opinion, that allows a second look. I've debated this a lot. Dick and I have talked about it quite a bit. A second look in the sense there needs to be a second set of documents and a second set of evaluations that are purely based on intellectual gifts. We have a thing called an academic OER, which means nothing. My suggestion has been for years to have an evaluative system that's parallel. One that's done based on manner of performance, one that's done based on objective examination and testing to determine whether or not you've got the right stuff. No one should get into a staff college or a war college without passing an examination. Now, what does that mean? Well, no one makes general without going to the war college, so at least those who are coming up for BG selection have had at least one cut. But that's not enough. Here we're talking about building a much smaller group. And how do you do that? Well, you do it through professional military education. What's happened, unfortunately, at exactly the wrong time, is we've created what in essence is a bathtub, if you will, of those who are properly educated for this function, all driven by the necessities of war. Every year we defer something like 225, 230 officers from the War College and more from the Staff College. Remember, the Staff College teaches operational art, the War College teaches strategic art. And this has been going on now for a decade. And so we have a body now of colonels, and in some cases generals, who are going to go and select in their own image, and many of them have not even had an exposure to professional military education since they were captains. That's not right. That's got to change. So how do you do it? Well, you do it a couple of ways. One of my recommendations, which I think is probably about right, is to find a system by which we connect the learning program or process for the best and the brightest, beginning in ROTC and going all the way up through charm school at the general officer level. One way to do that is to create a systems of sort of mega universities that do this sort of thing, to sort of take away the art or teaching the strategic art away from the military and put it more on civilian universities. Because remember, the key element of the Petraeus model is not going to West Point or to the Army War College, it's going to Princeton. Certainly the thing that changed my life was coming here. So that needs to be institutionalized in some way. Perhaps we can create a dozen or so of these universities that have a touch that goes from ROTC to fully funded graduate school, to fellows programs, to Professor USAWC and USMA, those who we prepare for Ph.D.s to go on and teach in our different service schools and military academies. And then perhaps a seniors course at this same university. So a young man or woman can go to Duke and take ROTC and then come back to Duke after company command to finish the master's degree, maybe an ABD in there somewhere, and then get their Ph.D. 2 or 3 years later when they're a fellow. So when they show up at OSD and they run across this great tigress who we've all met, this blonde, blue-eyed, 32-year-old, newly minted Georgetown M.A., and he puts his face in the nose of this colonel who's got 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, a Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and hasn't a clue about how the system works or how to work the system. That, to me, is the greatest tragedy that can happen in our system. We can avoid that by building these. Now, who are they? I mean, many of these you know. I would obviously throw Duke in the bunch, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But Ohio State, Princeton, Texas A&M comes to mind. Stanford's got a great program. Notre Dame, got to say that. Georgetown, because it's close to the flagpole. And there are a couple of sort of new guys on the block. One comes to mind is North Texas University. He's very aggressive and very young and sort of on the beam to do this. So here's the irony of it all. Some of the great movers and changers that we revere today, some of the great documents that we revere for changing the culture and changing the focus from big to little wars, were written by people who were captains. In my book, I talk about 4 dissertations. Many of you know these. Andy Krepanevich, remember the Army in Vietnam? He wrote it as a major in 1978. I think it was for Princeton. No, for Harvard. That completely changed our approach to how the Army selects officers at the tactical and the operational level. H.R. McMaster, remember Eagle 6-6 and the Great Wheel, wrote the book Dereliction of Duty. And it's become, as a captain, it's become a standard, been printed 20 or 30 times, and it explains how strategic leadership failed at the JCS in Vietnam. The president, both the last 2 presidents, put it by their bedside, written by a captain. John Nagel, Eating Soup with a Knife. This was the intellectual document that drove the counterinsurgency manual that changed how the Army fights in Iraq and Afghanistan. Wrote it as a captain. What is this telling us? Should we wait till a guy makes colonel to go to the War College to find out if he's got the strategic right stuff? No. We do it here in graduate school, where he's exposed to something other than a company commander, and he's got to demonstrate skills different than raising the red flag at 7 o'clock in the morning. Now, in order to do this, the system probably doesn't mean much to you, but the system, in order to make this happen, has to be able to give officers joint credit for coming here to Duke. So he doesn't have to do double duty by being a recreation officer in Diego Garcia to get credit for a joint tour. It's stupid. That's ignorant. By the way, Ike Skelton agrees with that. Now let's get to the final part. The final part has to do with the honors course. Now, Leavenworth has an honors course called the School of Advanced Military Studies that winnows down the group, but it doesn't recognize the group as a distinct entity. The Army needs something similar to that at the War College. I started a thing called ASAP, the Advanced Strategic Arts Program, a stupid name. Sorry I picked it. But the idea is the same, a strategic SAMS. It takes a body of 13 to 15 young men and women who are exceptional in their ability to think critically and to think strategically, and immerses them in a case study-based, year-long effort that simply studies history as a way to understand the strategic art. But the problem with it is, of course, there's no exception to it. There's no way to put people who do this, demonstrate intellectual excellence, into positions of influence where they can then go on to get promoted. So the Army has as much of a personnel problem as it does of an educational problem. It's not enough to make people like this. It's something else to keep them and to advance them and to make them generals. Now, this gets a lot of people upset because they say, oh, well, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create another German general staff. This is elitist in a country that embraces egalitarianism, particularly in a service that's America's Army. We have this long tradition of being a drafted force, and therefore this is just not in our culture to do this. Well, I think that's all a bunch of crap. Of course the Army is elitist. It's a pyramid that's just as sharp and just as stark as, I don't know, Microsoft and Google. And it has to select out the best and brightest because someone has to lead. And what makes the Army so much more difficult to manage is there's no lateral entry, or very little lateral entry. You know, Grant did it, but he's pretty much the exception. So what we have in this system of building these narrow elites, building the best and the brightest who have been tested, evaluated, and proven in their ability at the strategic art, is we're able then to put a marker on a young officer at a very early age, to let him or her stand out from their peers, not based on who their father is, but based on their proven ability to think and write, or to think critically and to write and to speak. And when that happens, a couple of things are going to happen in the opposite direction. Ask a young officer, what would you rather do? Be a J2 in Diego Garcia, or would you rather go to Duke? Well, that's an easy one. I'd rather go to Duke. But, sir, I'm not going to do it, as my daughter told me a few years ago, because Branch told me that if I go 2 years to Notre Dame to get a degree and then go to West Point, it's going to kill my careers. Same thing was told to Petraeus, was told to Corelli, it was told to Dempsey, told to me. You just can't do that. It's not career enhancing. Well, until you see a group of captains lined up outside the personnel building at Fort Knox with their college transcripts and GREs in their hand, winding a block or so around the building, none of this is going to work. Because until an officer values intellectual as well as practical achievement and manner of performance in equal degrees, then this cultural change simply won't happen. And if the base isn't broad enough to produce this rich soup of contenders, then when you have to pick a person to do these critical jobs, you'll pick the wrong person, someone who doesn't have the intellectual capacity to do it. How would I see this? It would go something like this, and I'll get off the stage with this. I see it coming like this. The Brigadier General's Board in the Holy of Holies says in 2 years we're going to need a brigadier at the National Security Council. Here are a file of 20 colonels, all of whom have Ph.D.s in the social sciences, who've led a brigade or a battalion, and these are their files, and this is what people say about their manner of performance, and here's what they say about their intellectual achievement. Oh, by the way, here are their papers, here's their dissertation, here's their academic review reports from civilians as well as military. Okay, I'll take Betty. Now, Betty's not going to go tomorrow. Betty's probably going to have to do 2 or things before that slot at the National Security Council opens up. But when it opens up, the chief now will have 2 choices, both equally well prepared for this job that he can pick from based on his own judgment, rather than having to settle. If we are able to do that, it would give us a level of strategic and richness that would allow us to do a couple of things. Number 1, strategic genius, to operate at an incredible level. Number 2, to be able to do military-civilian discourse, to provide advice to the civilian authority in the respectful manner that it should be provided. Number 3, to run the institution with genius, to be able to steer this monstrous ship through peace and war, and to do it seamlessly. And most important, for me at least, we have to build a small body of probably neglected people who are the anticipators, guys like Charlie, who have the ability to see into the future, to walk out to that mountain 15, 20 years from now and look back and figure out where that course is going to take us. Because if it takes 12, 15 years to develop a tank, or 40 years to develop the F-35, I'm sorry, I had to say it, then you just, the flash to bang time just isn't there to be able to do this instantaneously. So you have to have a body of people who can look over the next hill and anticipate what's going to happen. We have to, those don't just grow out of trees. They have to be fostered. How do you do it? First of all, how successful have you been, Bob? As I told Dick last night, not very. How do you do it? The military won't do it to itself, because you ask an average general about how you make generals, and he'll look at you dead in the eye and say, well, it needs to be like me, because I'm perfect. So just do it like you did for me. No, that's not it. It's going to take something extraordinary, and a very brave effort by Bob Gates in 2007 to defy the Joint Chiefs and the chiefs of the Army to construct that board, I think, is a template about how we might do it in the future. The Army won't change, or the military won't change. It needs to be someone outside the military to force change, and to start now. Militaries, as a rule, change most effectively as wars wind down. That's when you have a little bit of money and a little bit of time, and you have the ability to reflect on what just happened. Armies ossify after about 5 or 6 years after a war, and they're stuck until we do it again. Now is the time to do this, as I've said in many speeches I've given. And it's not going to happen unless someone with a great deal more authority than anybody in this room makes a decision to do it. Your questions? Do we have time for questions? Any questions? Yes, sir. Oh, we got a microphone. Should I stand by a microphone? By you. Go ahead.
General, you had alluded at the beginning of the presentation to some of the privileges that attend flag rank in the U.S. military, and it certainly seems that in some of the recent scandals, particularly with regards to General Ward, the degree to which general officers have become accustomed to those privileges contributes significantly to the scandal. To what extent do you think reducing or eliminating some of the traditional privileges that attend generalship would contribute to a better ethical culture, to a better group of leaders?
That's a great question. I'm going to patronize you here in a minute with my answer, but let me give you a simple answer. First of all, most generals don't quite have the trappings of a combatant commander, which is what Kip's an older dear friend of mine. I've known him for 25 years. So he's a little bit of an outrider in the level of privileges. Lower-ranking generals, particularly most of us in staff positions and so forth, may have an aide, sometimes don't even have an aide, so that's overblown. But the real answer, it's like I said to Kip, the real answer I said to Kip at a Christmas party, when was that, Diana? It was before Christmas. I shook him and I said, what the F were you thinking? I said, here comes the patronization, I said, don't you have a lawyer? I did. Don't you have a lawyer? Don't you know this was wrong? He said, yeah, I did. I said, what did he tell you? He said, he told me not to do it. And the rest, and the rest is that we had this discussion last night. And the rest, as they say, is history. You know, rank, any rank, whether it's president or there's this huge bow wave of hubris that comes with it. Generals are accepted animals, The animal analogy is all they do is just sit on their ass and bark, But they're accepted animals in the sense that they're treated differently, and part of it should be this idea of treatment. They should not be as isolated as they are, and left to have these hubristic sort of things pop up from them and their spouses. And in Kip's place, it was a shared deal. Excellent question, and I agree with you completely. I do. Yes, sir.
General, that was really brilliant. Thank you very much. I would only disagree with one aspect of your presentation, and that is the metaphor of the pendulum for our future wars. I would submit that it may be more of a dynamic of a dialectic, as we have heard, that war with Iran or China, for example, will not be big army. It will be cyber. It will be all the other things that we've discussed here.
Yeah, the dialectic, that's right, I'm at Duke, dialectic, come on, Bob. No. My first professor here was a guy who was a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist, and he had me over at East Campus and just literally tore me apart. So yeah, dialect. I could lecture about Kant and Hegel and all that crap. But you're right, dialectic is a better word. Dialectic is a better word. But see, this just proves the need to build into someone the intellectual flexibility to deal with the unknown. Not just to deal with it, but to anticipate it. It's not enough to wake up one morning and say, holy shit, there's a cyber problem out there. It's another thing to be able to think like this through and to put in place the organizations that deal with it before it becomes a problem. Thinking in time, of course, is the phrase we use. How do you do that? Are some born with it? I would argue maybe, but most aren't. We don't need a lot of people that I've just described to you. Maybe 24, maybe more, by the time you build the staffs and so forth. And that's not much to ask in a country of 340 million people, but you have to be able to cultivate it. It just simply doesn't sprout. You would never try a case before the Supreme Court without going to law school. Why the hell would you expect a 4-star to command 500,000 soldiers in battle against a diabolical and ingenious and adaptive enemy without going to school, without passing the bar? Good God. But we do. I don't get it. Questions? Yeah, Dick? By the way, Dick and I were on the Congressional Quadrennial Defense Review 2010, and we were put on there specifically by Ike Skelton to fix professional military education, and neither one of us can profess any success.
Right. You skipped briefly over the question of retention.
Yeah.
And I would wonder whether the personnel system has to adjust much more deeply. For example, retention has to do with adjusting to having professional spouses.
Yeah.
Adjusting to family life,
Right.
adjusting to frequent permanent change of station.
Absolutely.
Adjusting to compensation.
Right.
And I don't think any of the services are willing or able to adjust the conditions of service. They certainly wouldn't do it for a couple of dozen people or the below the zone people. It has to be a larger cultural change in the use of its personnel by all of the armed services.
Yeah, absolutely right, absolutely right. In fact, one of the things that I suggested in this monograph I'm writing for the DoD is that when an officer is selected for a 2-year sabbatical at Duke or named graduate school, that his spouse is paid for as well if she qualifies. And there are many other things that I've suggested along that same line. Most officers leave either because they don't achieve the professional goals at a young age that their contemporaries are achieving, or their wife says, that's it, you're not going back to Afghanistan, I've had enough of this shit, we're quitting. It's true. Or a combination of both as a rule. And the problem is that we're losing many of the best and brightest at too young an age. You can see that by the numbers with graduate degrees, Rhodes Scholars, Olmsted Scholars. Those young kids who've done so well academically are sadly often the first to leave. Very sad. There's a question in the back. Yes, sir.
Just as an analogy, sir, on the spouses, when an officer is selected for duty as a defense attaché, the spouse goes with them through the Joint Military Attaché School,
Right.
because frequently the wife ends up being as important to that assignment as the husband.
Yeah, a quick anecdote. And I would include in this cohort of strategic genius those who have the cultural affinity, cultural acuity that we did not have in Iraq in either one of the wars. I sat on a colonel selection board, 1990, that had 19 FAOs, foreign area officers. These are guys who speak various languages and live in various areas. And there were four Arab speakers. In other words, they were almost perfect speaking and writing in Arab. And of those 19, guess how many we selected for colonel? Exactly. And that's not right. That just shows you how we violate the tenets that I've just given you. What difference would it have made in that tent outside of Basra if Schwarzkopf would have had one of those colonels standing next to him trying to interpret what the Iraqi general was telling him rather than having an Iraqi tell him what the Iraqi general was telling him? Just read the history. Could have changed the course of the world, and we are only marginally better today at taking foreign service officers and giving them responsible positions, usually not in command. It's very sad. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, I was so enthralled, but that even I got off my schedule here. But if you want to know why I'm the way I am, you can see my mentor here. Absolutely brilliant, sir. Very much appreciated. And let me tell you, folks, you heard a lot of inside baseball this morning, more than I would have expected. But very good. Thank you so much. Let's come back at 20 of. Take a quick break.